Good afternoon. It is a pleasure to welcome you all today on behalf of the Institute for European Studies of the ULB and of the CEVIPOL to this double book launch on teaching and theorizing the European Union in times of crisis, where we will present two new publications, Governance and Politics in the Post-Crises European Union, published by Cambridge University Press in 2020, with Ramona Coman, Amandine Crespy, who's showing the cover, and Vivian Schmidt as co-editors. And the second book, Theorizing the Crises of the European Union by Routledge. There it is. This one on 2021, edited by Nathalie Brack and Seda Gürkan. I am Maria Isabel Soldevilla, the IEE Communication Director, and I will be moderating the session. We can say without blushing and with great satisfaction that this is a real anti-manual. We want to thank especially the distinguished academics who join us today as discussants, just as the European Council meets to debate yet another crisis. Professor Olivier Costa, Director, among other things, of the Department of European Political and Governance Studies of the College of Europe, Thomas Christiansen, Professor in the Political Science Department at Luis Università Guido Carli, Clément Fontan, Professor at the Faculty of Economics, Social, Political and Communication Sciences at UCLOUVAIN, and Celeste Bonnamy, Assistant and PhD Researcher in Political Science at the ULB and the Université Paris 1 Panthéon-Sorbonne. Thank you all and welcome today. For the first part of this session, we will be doing a 15-20 minute Q&A with the editors, and then we will give the floor to the discussants. So let's begin. I will turn to you, Seda, first. It seems that crisis has been the status quo for the European project, at least in the recent past. When we refer to crisis in the context of the book, what are we talking about, and what is the impact that crises have had on European integration?
Thank you very much, Maria Isabel. But before starting, let me add my voice to yours and thank the Institute and CEVIPOL and our discussants for the opportunity. It's a real pleasure to be able to discuss our book with distinguished scholars in European studies. So thank you for the opportunity. Thank you also for your question. Your question goes actually to the heart of our volume with Nathalie and also to today's discussion. One of the main intentions of the book was to reflect on the concept of crisis and to understand what's a crisis, what really constitutes a crisis. And second line of reflection was on understanding what all these successive problems, challenges, or crisis since 2008 mean for the European integration. In the book, we conceptualize the crisis as an extraordinary, abnormal point in time, which alters subsequent decision-making procedures, routine, ordinary, or normal functioning of the European Union. The definition actually includes two elements. As a point in time, but also as a process. The crisis is a point in time because there is usually this unexpected, abrupt shock which compels political actors to take a new set of decisions. And usually these decisions are taken with a sense of urgency. These shocks, which might be internal or external, are very specific points in time, and they require immediate political action because usually the cost of non-action during this phase is high. But there's a second phase, which makes the crisis also a process. This second phase starts once these political decisions are taken as a response to this shock. And these decisions alter subsequent modes of governance or ways of doing in the European Union. So in other words, the crisis is a situation which compels actors to adopt new rules, tools, to address this situation. In this way, it leads to a change in the dynamics of integration and the shape of the system of governance of the Union. All the chapters in our edited volume converge on this observation that the conceptualization of the crisis should be broadened to include also the implications of these shocks for the integration process. A similar reflection on the meaning of crisis is also addressed in Ramona Amandine and Virginie Schmidt's book, where there is a distinction between fast and slow burning phases of a crisis. The second part of your question is on the nexus between crisis and the EU's integration process. How do they interact? Concerning the impact of the crisis on the European integration, the literature has already concluded that crisis might have...
We're not hearing you. We have a little problem hearing you. Can you try again?
Can you hear me?
Yes, now it's good.
Okay. The literature had already suggested that crisis might lead to very different outcomes for the European integration. The crisis might lead to negative consequences in the form of vertical or horizontal disintegration, as we have seen with Brexit, or might lead to positive consequences, like further integration, as we have seen with the Eurozone crisis in the second phase, or crisis might simply lead to the preservation of the status quo. But our attempt in the book was to go beyond these observations and question whether the decade of crisis since 2009 has triggered a more profound crisis in the European political integration, or if the malfunctioning of the European Union has driven and aggravated the impact of this difficult decade on the integration process. Our findings point to an interaction between the unfinished nature of the European project and the crisis. On the one hand, the unfinished nature of the European project made the EU prone or more vulnerable to crisis. On the other hand, the recent crisis context since 2009 worsened the already existing problems in the European Union. Several challenges to the European integration, like legitimacy crisis, democratic deficit, structural institutional problems, have all existed long before the EU's age of crisis. But these inherent problems had a catalyzing impact, or turned these distinct crises into more profound integration crises. In other words, they aggravated the impact of this crisis on the integration process. On the other hand, these recent multiple crises that we observe since 2009 have exacerbated the already existing problems of the European Union and led to a transformation of the European Union. So I'm sure we will be discussing this transformation of the EU during the last decade in the coming minutes. But I don't want to exceed my 5 minutes. So over to you, Maria Isabel, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Seda, and thank you for your discipline. That's perfect. I turn to Ramona now with a follow-up question on what you have started to explain. And of course, the past decade has been filled with all sorts of crises. We've been through an economic crisis, a so-called migration crisis, terrorism, Brexit, now COVID-19. You have studied governance and politics in this context. And I'd like to ask you now, Ramona, what can you say about institutional change and adaptations in this crisis context? Have the solutions proposed been temporary, or have the institutions been reshaped in a more permanent manner by the crisis?
Well, thank you very much, Maria Isabel, for this very interesting question. What I can say is that shedding light on institutional change, both formal and informal, was one of the aims of our book. So governance and politics in the post-crisis European Union was written indeed in times of great turmoil. So it is about how the European Union's policies and institutions have changed in light of the multiple crises since 2010. Let me say that our reflection started in the fast-burning phase of the Eurozone crisis, this concept on which we worked collectively in a Horizon 2020 project called Enlighten, to which many of our contributors participated. So we started our reflection in the fast-burning phase of the Eurozone crisis, and Amandine will confirm the manuscript went to press 1 year ago in March 2020 at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, and we were in contact at that time with Thomas Christiansen, talking about the title of the book. So a new crisis, a health global crisis, which sadly, seriously is challenging the European Union again. So let me answer now your question. And indeed, the first part of the book discusses institutional change. And our great team of contributors show that not only the treaties in the post-Maastricht era, but also this decade of crisis have put the decision-making processes and modes of governance under strain and have shifted the balance of power at the EU level. So to give you an example, several changes are conceptualized in the first part of the book by Sergio Fabbrini, for example, and Vivian Schmidt. They complement each other. What is new? They try to answer this question, what is new, what is old in terms of modes of governance. And here I would summarize very briefly what Sergio Fabbrini conceptualized in terms of decision-making regimes, one supranational and one intergovernmental. What do they have in common? Well, the growing role of the European Council, which instructs the Commission and the Parliament in the supranational decision-making regime. And we see that in the intergovernmental decision-making regime, the European Council downsizes the role of the Council. So who governs? Who leads the integration? Well, the power relationships between the institutions are brilliantly conceptualized by Vivian Schmidt, our co-editor, who argue that in order to understand the power dynamics at the EU level, we should see powers and responsibilities as intertwined and dynamically interactive. So to conclude also and to answer your very, very interesting question, are the changes temporary or permanent? Well, I would say that some of the institutional changes that we captured in the book tend to become permanent. There is a phenomenon of layering because the EU is facing a new global crisis. And I would say also, but maybe we can talk more in the Q&A session, I would also say that we have more disputes between the member states, which are solved or not solved by the European Council. So I would say that the role of the European Council tends to become permanent for many, many reasons, more involved, not only in the EU's overall political direction and priorities, which is the traditional role, of course, of the European Council, but also in policy detail, in implementation, interfering in the legislative processes, although, as we know, the European Council is not a legislative institution, acting, as some have very recently argued, ultra vires. So I hope we will have more time to talk about institutional changes later. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Ramona. And perhaps with Nathalie, focus on some of the shared ideas of the books. Both books are born, it seems, from an understanding that the theoretical framework was surpassed by the events, that new concepts, new tools were needed to study the EU. And perhaps say a little bit about what are the main novelties that the books bring to the table.
Thank you very much for your question. Of course, both books are different, fortunately. Otherwise, we would just repeat each other. And it's difficult to do justice to the variety of the different chapters in each edited volume. But I would like to stress three elements, I think, and then in the Q&A we can discuss more about other elements and to compare both books. So I think indeed the idea behind the book was to analyze the recent crisis and the impact that had either on the integration process, on EU studies, or the EU, its politics and policies. And one of the aims was clearly to take stock and to bring a better understanding of the crisis, as I said, as an event in a point in time, but also as a process and their consequences. And I think one of the added value of both books is to take into account a large variety of crises, from the Eurozone to Brexit, the conflict of values or migration crisis. And both books combine a sort of comparative analysis of the various crises and the strengths and weaknesses of various theoretical approaches. And by doing so, they bring new insight on what's going on in the EU at the moment and what's going on in EU studies. A second element is that both books call for a sort of enhanced dialogue between approaches and sub-disciplines in EU studies. For instance, in our book with SEDA, we questioned the utility of classical integration theories, and we try to see how we can incorporate more recent approaches, such as sociological approaches, critical social theory, or differentiated integration. And we believe that this comparative overview leads to a better understanding of the crisis and their impact. And Ramona and Amandine's book also discusses different approaches and their assumptions in analyzing how the EU works today after the crisis. And their book relies on an analysis of a wide array of policy fields to show the consequences of specific crises and how they spilled over in various and sometimes unexpected policy fields. And finally, I think both books had a clear ambition to understand the impact and the consequences of this decade of crisis. They show that there is a transformation of the EU as a political system, of EU politics as well, and EU policies. And as Ramona explained, there have been intense institutional changes, and the impact on the decision-making process has been important. And both books highlight in their own way, of course, that although crisis represented a critical juncture for European integration, they were more an accelerator of pre-existing trends. So with the exception maybe of increased politicization at all levels in the EU, crises have not been a game changer as such, but rather revealed persisting conflicts in EU policies and with a deep impact on key issues such as legitimacy, sovereignty, cleavages in European society. So basically, that's three main elements I wanted to stress.
Thank you very much, Nathalie. I'll turn to you, Amandine. Some of the points that Nathalie touched respond a little bit of partially my next question, but let's give it a twist. Both your books speak to each other in a way. How do you think they do? Are they complementary? And if so, how? And who are they meant for? Who needs to go and get these books? Turn your mic on.
Sorry. Yes, thank you, Marie-Isabel. So I think that both books clearly put to the fore the recognition that crises are a main driver of integration. And in a way, they've become perhaps paradoxically the new normal of EU integration. And it's important because this means that with crises go more visibility. And so I think that both books speak to each other in the sense that they show that reactions, both from elites, but also from citizens to those crises, shape EU integration in a very decisive way. So of course, the books are complementary. The book by Nathalie and Seda focus on theories. And so perhaps there is this reflective moment for us as European scholars to also, which constrains us to revise our theories and reassess their relevance. Whereas our textbook is more trying to capture institutional and policy change, but both books really emphasize a shift away from overly functional understandings of European integration. And both books really point to the key importance of politics, and certainly domestic politics, in driving change, and of course of politicization processes as well. So I think that a common ambition of both books was also, well, I believe, to stimulate critical thinking. So both among scholars and certainly among students, as far as we are concerned. So we're trying to, you know, perhaps, hopefully, mainstream the critical approaches to EU integration into what remains, or what is seen very widely as mainstream theories and mainstream studies in the field, and reflect more on the impact of European integration on citizens, and stimulate a critical approach to also the capacity, not only to this impact on citizens and societies, but also a critical approach to the very capacity of the EU to deal with and to alleviate, hopefully, the great problems of our time, namely social inequality within national societies, but also globally as a source of migration, of course, the green transition, and the weakening of democracy.
Thank you very much, Amandine. And with this, we conclude our first part of the session with a really quick introduction of what the books are about. And I will now give the floor to our distinguished discussants. Each of you will have 7 to 8 minutes for your first reactions and questions. We will have a few rounds. When you have 1 minute left, since I cannot squeeze a little note next to you, you will see a thumbs up that will tell you that you have 1 minute left, and it's best I can do. And when your time is up, I will be very nice and give you an acclamation, and you will know that you have to wrap up. So let's hope this is good enough. I invite all of the discussants to turn their cameras on. And as we did before, keep your microphones off until it's your turn to speak. I propose that we hear the 4 of them, and then we go back to you for a reaction and response to their questions. We would like to start with Professor Olivier Costa, again, Director of the Department of European Political and Governance Studies of the College of Europe. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Maria Isabel. I'm very lucky to be the first one to speak, because everything has been said, and then we will say that again 4 times. And so I'm the first to repeat what has been very nicely said by the editor. So I will comment specifically on the book by Ramona, Amandine, and Vivienne, but since my comments will be quite general, I think that they will also apply to the book by Seda and Nathalie. I will not comment on the content of the book because 7 minutes is too short for that. There is a very impressive list of contributors. And I will discuss more about the overall design of the book, but I encourage people watching us just to go on the website of the publisher, who's doing a wonderful job in providing the introduction, table of content, and some marketing information that really allows people to get a sense of what is in the book before buying it. So to my knowledge, this is the very first textbook dealing systematically with EU crisis. Or better, it is the first textbook that proposes an analysis of the EU, its institution, and especially its policies, because there is much on the policies, by systematically considering the issue of crisis. And I think this is a wonderful idea, because the question of crisis is a very interesting one and very important one. When I was a PhD student, that was the time of the ratification of the Maastricht Treaty. And among the scholars studying EU, everybody thought that this is an accident, something that should not have happened. I mean, the rejection of the treaty by the Danish. And the main explanation was Eurosceptic are just uneducated, stupid people, and they didn't get it. And so we will fix that. And the solution on the side of EU institution was something like, let's print a bit more brochure to fix the issue and educate people. And as you know, it was not fixed. So since then, let's say in the last 20 years, people have taken a bit more seriously the question of the EU crisis, but then we have two narratives that are not satisfying. The one is next crisis is the final one. This is the book by Ivan Krastev of 2016, explaining us that the EU is going to fail. It did not. Then he takes the book again in 2019 and explaining that now it's going to fail. It's still not failed. And the other approach is to say, yo, it's not crisis, it's just events. This is life, this is history. And I think we need a third approach, which is provided by that excellent book we're discussing today, that there are crises and the EU will survive. As said by Amandine, crisis is a new normal. The guy who invented this one should have trademarked that. He would be rich today. And the crisis are shaping the EU, shaping institution, policies, decision, objectives. They are the result of the adjustment between crisis and what actors try to do. And clearly, if we look at the situation, no substantial progress of EU integration has been made in the last 20 years without a crisis, which is creating a sense of necessity. By default, I would say that it's a status quo, and there is a consensus to do something only when there is a crisis to fix, because federalists today are too weak to propose something. And then crises alone do not write treaties and regulation, and so you need also at some point actors to fix those crises and to react. And so I think this is the right way to study the EU. We can make, in fact, a parallel between the EU and the evolution of life. The question is it intelligent design or is it a Darwinian process? I would say that the EU is certainly not the result of intelligent design, because even the initial treaty of the 50s were too bizarre to be considered as the result of an intelligent design. So it's a Darwinian process. It's a process of selection and adaptation to the political, economic, international, social context. Institutions are the result of that process. Policies are the result of that process. And we can say that basically even the first steps were just a reaction of the big crisis that was the Second World War, which was a kind of our civil war. So, okay, EU is not only the result of crisis, there are also moments of grace and cohesion, which lead to some progress, the creation of new institutions, new procedure, new policies. But in the last, let's say, 30 years, the deepening of European integration has been mainly a matter of adaptation to events, to crises that could have killed European integration at some point. So this book is just coming at the right moment. Several years ago, I decided to create a couple of courses at the college. I've invited Nathalie to teach a research seminar on the resistance to Europe. I've asked Amandine to teach a course on EU legitimacy in question using the exit voice and loyalty. And by that time, some of my colleagues were quite suspicious about that. Why do we need to focus on those issues? Why do you want to pay attention to critical discourse that are supposed, in their view, to be stupid or to be wrong? They are normatively wrong, so we should not address the concerns of Eurosceptics or people resisting to the EU. But now everybody agrees that it's impossible to study the EU without paying attention to crisis and to real life, and so it's becoming totally mainstream. And each time the college is filling in the application to get our EU grant or to report on its activity, the two courses that I highlight is the one by Nathalie and the one by Amandine, saying, yes, the college is not only preaching about European integration or praying for a federal future, we are also connected with real life. And I would say that in EU institutions, it's the same. 10 years ago, they didn't want to hear those stories. Now they are really willing to understand what is going wrong, what they're supposed to do to face that very hostile environment, to develop policies that are capable to please people. So we had the classes, now we have the book, and which is even a textbook. And this is important because we had numerous books, edited books on the EU crisis. There are at least 20. But in my knowledge, it's the first textbook which systematically use the concept of crisis to analyze what the EU is, how it works. And I think it's super important to have a real understanding of the EU as it is today. Otherwise, it's impossible to understand what is going on. And it's also very important to fuel the discussions the reflection of our students. We need to encourage them to do a critical thinking on the EU. And this is not that easy, because some professors are resisting to that, some students are also resisting to that. And every year I have some students having some question that does not understand the difference between an analytical statement and a normative statement. And when I say there are 1/4 of the MEPs who are Eurosceptics, there is always a student saying, yeah, but this is wrong. That point is not it's wrong or right. The point is that those guys are there. And we need to understand why they are there and what they do. Yeah, but they're wrong. That's not the point. And so I think we need also to educate our students, because we have so many textbooks on the EU which are a bit preaching for the federal future. This was the title of the famous textbook by Duz and Sijansky, published in '92, The Federal Future of Europe. It was a textbook about the EU, predicting its federal future, advocating for its federal future, or looking at EU institutions only when there was something federal in that. And I think this is really something we should stop doing. And so congratulations to Ramona, Amandine, and Vivienne for the great work.
Well, that was perfect timing. I didn't even have to remind you. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor Costa. We may continue now with Celeste Bonnamy, who's assistant and PhD researcher in political science, both at the ULB at the Université Paris 1 Panthéon-Sorbonne. Celeste, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to discuss the book. I will focus more on the book by Nathalie and Seda. As a preliminary remark, I would like to highlight the fact that this book is really a brilliant example of how to exploit the challenging format that is an edited volume. Indeed, to give some coherence to a collective book is a very difficult exercise, and here in the book there are very different theoretical approaches that are mobilized, and some of the chapter may even disagree with each other in their conclusions, and I think especially about Ian Manner's chapter. But that is exactly what makes the strength of the book. Indeed, because the main argument is to question the relevance of integration theories and concepts in times of crisis, the book had to have a real theoretical diversity. And I think that was a very clever choice from the editors to frame the book that way. So for that, congratulations. And now I would have 3 series of remarks and questions. So first, I think one of the main achievements of your book is that it really demonstrates the heuristic value of both mainstream and less mainstream integration theory to understand and explain the causes, the consequences, and that is of peculiar importance for the political sociologist I am, the management of the crisis at the European level. And instead of trying to come up with yet a new integration theory, you take the time to establish a state of play that actually shows that these integration theories are not as much in crisis as the European Union. But I think what comes out from this collective book is that maybe the status of grand theory might be overestimated, and that there are actually middle range theories of European studies in the sense of Merton, each allowing to understand, explain specific moments or aspects of the multidimensional crisis. For example, new intergovernmentalism, sorry, it's a hard one to say, and the Euro crisis that is discussed in chapter 5, or neo-functionalism and the Brexit crisis discussed in chapter 6. On that, my question would be why scholars seem to be keeping on opposing these different theories, as is in the case in some of the chapters, 5, 6, 7, and 9, for instance. And would you agree that a combination of integration theories can report on the complexity of the European society in a more satisfactory manner? My second comment concerns what I believe to be the second, if not most important achievement of your book, that is your conceptualization of crisis. Beyond the broad definition you give in your introduction, where you define crisis as, and I quote, an extraordinary abnormal point in time which alters subsequent decision-making procedures and routine, ordinary normal functioning of the polity. crisis, as you said in the first part of this discussion, being both a point in time and a process, and I think it's very important. I think what comes out after reading the 12 chapters that follow this definition is that you actually manage to go beyond the term polycrisis that comes from the political field, as it was popularized by Jean-Claude Juncker himself. And you also go beyond the classic integration grand theories by pulling together three main concepts that could work as a practical toolkit to think the EU crisis. The three concepts I think of are legitimacy, that was mainly explored by Christopher Lord in chapter 2, sovereignty, explored by Nathalie, Ramona, and Amandine in chapter 3, and politicization, that is explored mainly in chapter 4, 7, but also chapter 6. And beyond the specific chapters that I mentioned, I think those are the three concepts that really hold the 13 chapters together. And then my question would be, do you think this combination I mentioned in my first comment could actually be done through the use of these three concepts as a toolkit for the analysis of the decade of crisis the EU has endured? And my third and last comment would be a more critical one. And again, it might not come as a surprise coming from me, because it concerns your take on sociological approaches. I was happily surprised to find a chapter dedicated to the sociological approaches in your book, and that takes me back to my preliminary comments. And I think Sabine Sarroger really managed to give a complete and interesting overview of these approaches. But then my critique would be more on the definition of such approaches that seem to derive from your conclusion. You define them exclusively from the lens of the level of analysis, that is a micro-actor-based analysis. And I think that is a rather narrow view of sociological approaches that are much more than just a level of analysis, as they tend to focus also on the interaction between level of analysis and not only one level. So I think this view might be a bit unfair to sociology, and the most famous and classical illustration would be Michel Daubry's Sociology of Political Crisis. That led me to my third question for you. Why didn't you refer at all to Michel Daubry's classical work on crisis? And as I believe in the end that first, your approach could actually be very compatible with Daubry's hypothesis of continuity. And two, I think the decade of crisis the EU has been entering could actually be analyzed as a multi-sectorial crisis, which would show that sociological approaches have more to bring to the understanding of EU crisis than just the description of daily practices. And that would be it for me. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for sticking to the time on what concerns me. Like we agreed before, we'll keep all the questions for the end. And I will now ask Professor Thomas Christiansen to take the floor and make his comments and questions for the next round.
Thanks very much, Marisa Bell. Thanks to the organizers for inviting me. It's a pleasure and honor to speak with you about these two fantastic books. It's indeed a challenge to say something meaningful about such broad and comprehensive publications in a few minutes, and especially after everything that has already been said. So I try my best to add something to the discussion and maybe also raise a couple of questions. But above all, I would really like to congratulate the editors and authors for these important works. I mean, the point about let's say the shocking but also very welcome lack of gender balance among the editors was already mentioned, and I think maybe one should just emphasize that once more. Having moved recently myself from the Netherlands to Italy, I really have to say that there's still a lot to do in many parts of Europe, and this sort of publications, two of them by such strong editorial teams, is I think part of the solution of addressing that. So well done, and beyond that, I would say also, you know, in terms of the contributors, really actually very nice, a very nice balanced diversity among the contributors. I mean, obviously, these are huge topics. Obviously, we all somewhat become experts in crises now. I think beyond what was said earlier, I think we're seeing the mainstreaming of crisis scholarship in European Union studies. We all have to basically now be experts in understanding crises. And to some extent, everybody has something to say on that. As I think Olivier already mentioned, there's already quite a large volume of publications on crises. All the more important, I think, is to have publications like these, which are systematic, comprehensive, objective, and really help us to sort of categorize the field, as it were. I see both books really as essential teaching tools also to grasp this growing, rapidly evolving field of studying the European Union in the context of crises. It's actually a field of study which is likely to be dominated by more empiricist work, and indeed, sometimes I have to say the borderline between journalism and academic research is getting a bit fuzzy with all these blogs and everything, so it's really good to step back, and in that sense, really congratulations to the editors of the theory book in particular, to help us to give future researchers also the tools to categorize their more empirical observations on particular aspects, particular events, individual crises, and to see them in the broader context. In fact, the fact that both books cover a range of crises, I think, is also extremely welcome in the sense of, to some extent, getting beyond this N=1 problem that I often encounter when studying the EU. It allows us to basically do comparative research on crises, whether it's comparative case studies of different crises and their responses, or whether it's sort of in-case comparisons of different aspects, different roles of actors or stages in crisis management. So in that sense also, I think both books really provide a huge value to our future study. Both books, in a sense, are at one level quite similar, but at another level, as was already mentioned, are also very, very complementary. And not just complementary, they're really also quite linking one to another. I mean, both books, each book has a focus, one more on theory, one more on empirical developments. But in a sense, both are very much open and, in fact, recognize the need of the other, as it were. So I think one can and should really read them in tandem, as it were. Look at the theory publication in the light of empirical developments, which are richly treated in the other book, and vice versa. Look at the politics and governance chapters also through the lenses provided by the theory book. So in that sense, it's fantastic that they're published pretty much at the same time, and it's a great idea to discuss them now together. So maybe a few more words on each book individually. I mean, if I take the theory book first, I think it's impressive in its systematic treatment and I would say also very sophisticated treatment of theories. I mean, one could well imagine perhaps a temptation to say, okay, who's the winner? Which theory is best as explaining crisis, or which is worse, or which one should we discard, as it were? But I think the editors and the contributors resist that temptation and actually provide a very nuanced reading of how different theories deal with the crisis. I think every crisis, every theory, every approach is treated quite fairly. I do think and applaud, I would say, that there is a desire to upgrade, as it were, more marginal or critical or more recent developments to integration theory. I think that's great. It shows how vibrant the field is. It shows how it's evolving. But each approach, in a sense, gets its chance to measure itself against the challenge of studying the EU in crisis. Some do better than others. I think it's fair to say that perhaps the more recent approaches are doing better. They also maybe had more chance to come to grips with how sophisticated European integration has become. But in a sense, I think the purpose of the book is to really demonstrate weaknesses or limitations of each approach, and indeed also suggest adaptations and improvements to them. And I think that's that's extremely valuable. There's perhaps one thing that I find particularly interesting, which is sort of a distinction between treating crisis more as events and treating crisis more as part of a process or as processes themselves. And Sid already said that there is this focus on recognizing the procedural nature of crises. I think that's very, very interesting, both because, like I said, the more atheoretical treatments of crisis study would maybe focus more on events, you know, on the summit meeting here, on the external shock there, and so on. Whereas perhaps you know, the academic or theoretical treatment is more open to the process nature of things. But again, I think one needs to keep an eye on both. And in terms of evaluating theories, to what extent they're open to both, especially open to the more procedural aspect of crises. I just wonder what that makes in your eyes of what is arguably the most successful theoretical treatment, mainstream approach that you don't really discuss that explicitly in the book, which is liberal governmentalism. I mean, you have a chapter on sovereignty conflicts, and you refer to Moravcsik there, but what one could maybe say a few more words, and it would be interesting what you think in terms of how does liberal governmentalism stand up to all this. In my view, and that's why I'm also not terribly missing it. I'm quite critical of it myself, and I think that the limitation there is essentially the focus on events as opposed to processes. All right, I got my 1 minute warning, but in fairness to the other book, I also wanted to say there that it has unique value in a different way. I mean, it also has this textbook character that was already mentioned. It is incredibly comprehensive. It obviously does not. It came too early to deal with the COVID crisis, which some might find is a shame, but in many other ways is actually very positive, because in a sense this book can be read also as a toolbox to dealing with COVID, and in being ready as it is, I think it is extremely useful in that regard. I mean, the link between, let's say, or not the link, the coverage of institutions, policies, but also then legitimacy and democracy concerns also provides this nice linkage to the normative and legitimacy chapters in the theory book, and one should also read them, as it were, in conjunction with one another. So my question there, if I have a question to the editors, is quite obviously, you know, what messages or lessons do you draw from your research from the chapters which are more on the economic or the Eurozone crisis? What lessons do you draw for the current pandemic, and what that means, perhaps also with a view to economic governance of the EU? All right, thanks very much.
Thank you, Professor Christiansen. And to wrap up this first round, I invite Professor Clément Fontan to address the editors with his comments and questions.
Yes, thank you very much. I was a bit afraid of being the last to speak, as Olivier said before at the onset of the debate. But actually, it's good because I can ping some of my remarks and comments to other one interventions. So not so bad in the final. So Ramona, Amandine, and Vivian have actually pursued a very ambitious and difficult task, maybe as hard as reaching an agreement on the EU budget today, maybe. So they have actually burdened themselves with a double difficulty. The first difficulty is to actually write an edited textbook. Why? Because textbook usually ask for coherence, a certain degree of homogeneity, while this coherence is actually the classical Achilles heel of any edited volume. So this was the first difficulty. The second difficulty was to actually develop a critical analysis on the most problematic aspect of integration, to no longer teach the EU as it has been done, to stimulate readers' critical thinking. So all of this is in the forward, while giving the necessary knowledge on how the EU works. Okay, and for me, this is an incredibly difficult task, because usually in 8,000 words, you can explain how the EU works, but it's much harder to give a critical perspective, or you can do it the other way around. Okay, so with that in head, I would say that, well, of course, they were very courageous, and they actually have succeeded to meet this double challenge at least to a very large extent. I will explain at the end of the intervention why, in my opinion, it can be still strengthened. So first, and it's really worth it to note, the coherence between the chapters is quite remarkable. The authors truly speak the same language, even though some did not belong to the same academic field at the beginning. So there are historians, there are political economists, there are political scientists, sociologists, and even though there is such a diversity, I think that there has been a remarkable coordination effort made to really have similar structure, similar tone, similar scientific languages between all the chapters, and this is great. Actually, if one teacher was a bit lazy and wanted to do a course on the EU crisis, well, your syllabus material is already made, I would like to say. But actually, it goes, the strength of the book goes beyond that, because I think that the chapters actually are quite nice as a standalone chapters. They have their own currents, and they can be used for the less lazy teacher as maybe some individual readings for some specific classes. Let me give you an example. So I would like to focus very quickly on 4 chapters I really liked in the book. There are others, but for the sake of brevity, I will just focus on these 4 chapters. So the first chapter by Kiran Kalus-Patel on the historical roots of EU integration, I found that there was a very original analytical angle. It successfully showed what were the 3 factors which explain why earlier form of EU integration succeeded over potential competitors. So this was actually quite enlightening for me and quite original as well. I really also like Amadin's chapter on social policy, which give a very clear example on the main paradox of EU integration today, which is there is more interdependence between European economies and society, and there are also more resistance against EU integration. And so I think that social policy was a very nice example to show this strong paradox. Thanks to Julien Jean-Debos's chapter, I've also perfectly understood the concept of cremigration that I was not aware before. Its historical roots and its impact on the management of external border today. So this was very strong, I believe, also. And finally, I found a very nice critical discussion on Piketty's study on net capital outflow from East to Western Europe in Maskin and all chapter, which is something that I've learned also, even though I'm teaching about that topic, there is still something to learn, which I really like. Now, however, to a certain extent, there is also some room for critical improvement, I believe. In particular, I think that one interesting venue to critically teach the EU in a novel way would be to seriously consider the possibility of a normalization of EU study. So the normalization of EU study was a very big hot topic when I started my PhD. That was, wow, 12 years ago now. And there were multiple conferences on that. And somehow I think that maybe this element is a bit missing. So let me give you an example. When I teach EU political economy, the theoretical frameworks I use the most are the double movement from Karl Polanyi, the core periphery concept and the dependence theory that go with it, and the concept of Susan Strange of structural financial power. And these are very, if you want, normalized theoretical approach in political economy, at least. And that I think that the mobilization of this approach would have helped maybe to better identify the true cause of the Eurozone crisis. So this is a ping to Thomas Christiansen remark as well. So let's focus on that a bit more. Actually, I found it in the chapter of Cornelban, when he talked about the role played by cross-border private finance turbocharged by the ECB as a cause of the crisis. But then I was a bit, let's say, destabilized when I read in the chronology that, in fact, the crisis was caused by skyrocketing debt level in Greece and Ireland. So here I find somehow a contradiction on the cause of the crisis, or let's say that maybe both are true, but it would have been great to have the author's position on that. So there are competing explanation on the causes of the Eurozone crisis in the book. What do you think is the best explanation, or do you think they are competitive? Are they exclusive or not? So maybe that would be the first question for you. I also think that the mobilization of such theoretical framework, more normalized theoretical framework, I would say, could have also give some insight on the links between the political answer to the crisis and the backlash against the EU. So, for example, in her chapter, Vivian Schmidt talked about populist anger that was raised in the EU during the crisis. But while we know that populism is a difficult concept to mobilize in political sciences, it has a very ambivalent meaning and so forth and so on. And here maybe some definitional work, some positioning on the debates on populism would have actually helped to better understand precisely what were the consequences of this crisis on European people, as well maybe on the discussion about the economic, non-economic causes of the backlash. So this has been a huge debate in political sciences and political sociology as well, about how can we explain the rise of nativist far-right movements in Europe? Is it only linked to austerity, or is it linked to more structural, let's say, identitarian politic? So maybe a bit more about this would have also strengthened the textbook. And finally, maybe some empirical elements here are a bit missing. For me, the troika is a bit the absentee of the book. It's been quoted, but not so much, 2 or 3 times in the whole textbook. And I thought that the troika has defined actually the European crisis politics actually to a strong extent. For example, the forced resignation of Berlusconi in 2011 give way 2 years later to the political rise of the M5S or the Lega. And these episodes are a bit missing in the book. That would have explained a bit the new configuration as well of EU politics after the crisis. But of course, I'm very well aware that we all have a limited space, that we cannot do everything. So maybe it was just more some personal insight that I could provide here as way for maybe further development on certain issue. But overall, as I said, if I'm lazy one day, I know how I can do all my syllabus without doing anything. So thanks for that.
Thank you very much to all our discussants for their insights. I propose that we begin with Seda, Gürkan, and Nathalie Brack, so they can react and respond to the first questions, and then we'll go to Ramona and Amandine.
Okay, so maybe I will start, and Seda can add what she wants. So I want to first, of course, thank the discussant, and in particular Celeste and Thomas for their careful reading of the book and their critical and constructive comments. I think for the first point of Celeste, I think indeed it was one of our calls to combine approaches. Of course, you cannot combine everything together, and I think there are still oppositions between approaches, but it's true that in our conclusion, we try to bring together what we thought would be useful as approaches to study different aspects of the phenomenon, and we are not the only one to do so, of course. I think the combination of approaches is the most useful to understand what's going on, especially if we focus on the process of a crisis and not just as a point in time. But I think if we are honest, it sells more if you are part of one approach and you want to criticize your opponent on the scientific market. So I think that's one of the reasons why people want to stay in a box in a way, because in a way it's easier to study the event, and it's easier to sell the results by positioning yourself in a sort of adversarial manner. On your idea on sociological approaches, of course, we had to make some choices, and it echoes what Clément said also on the normalization of EU studies. Generally, I fully agreed with Clément on the fact that it should be the case. Here, we had to make some choices between what we wanted to do and what the editor also expected and the reviewers of the book also expected. So we focused on EU studies in particular. We excluded, for instance, institutionalist approach or federalism. And because, for instance, one of the reviewers thought that it was too EU focused, not on EU theories, but on the EU as a regional bloc, we also wanted to include other aspects, more global aspects that could help understanding what's going on in the EU through, for instance, a new regionalism approach, or Jan Manner's chapter on a more global perspective, which of course leads to losing some specific aspects on other approaches that we could have included. And yeah, it's a question of choices. And finally, and then said I can add whatever I'm missing on Thomas. Thank you very much for your comments. I agree with you on the liberal intergovernmentalism. For me, one of the main limitations is to focus on specific actors and specific point in times. I'm much more convinced, for instance, by the new intergovernmentalism and in explaining how the EU is moving on since the crisis, or even since the 90s. And for your question, although it's more for Amandine and Ramona to say, I think based on the lessons in terms of the management of the eco crisis, I would say the analysis by Olivier as a Darwinian process. I think the EU has learned some lessons from the Eurozone crisis, and I would hope that in managing the consequences of the pandemic, it would now at least act quickly and with some established institutional change that have been going on. So I expect the European Council to be, and the domestic actors to be keys.
Please, Seda.
Okay, thank you very much for all these beautiful comments. Actually, I was really relieved by these very nice comments by colleagues. Thank you very much. They're all very precious. Very quickly to Celeste's comments on the book, Nathalie has very well explained the choices we made or we had to make. But maybe to clarify for the audience, the real purpose of the book is that it was mainly a stock-taking exercise, because when we started reflecting on the book, it was, I guess, 2-3 years ago. And our point of departure was very much a stock-taking exercise of mainstream integration theories and understanding how far they are helpful in understanding EU's state of play or its functioning governance after this difficult decade of crisis. So we very much focused on mainstream theories, but at the same time, we tried to put at the center of all this crisis, of all these theories, the concept of crisis. So that was the challenge. And there was another challenge. It was trying to understand this big picture, this picture about the interaction between integration and the transformation of the political system, the entire political system. But obviously, this meant that we had to make some changes. And Nathalie has mentioned a couple of them. But I think from my point of view, obviously, the book could be improved, or we maybe need another volume to address all those issues. But there are mainly 3 points that we couldn't address in the book. The first one is that normative theories. We had to leave aside mainly normative theories like federalism would be the first theory to be included maybe in this stock-taking exercise. But from the very beginning, we said that we would not include normative theories. Another point, and this is the second, maybe one of the hard choices we had to make, it was excluding theories that could explain foreign policy making, because this is one of the domains that has been impacted by the crisis, and it's also, there's this interaction between internal decision making and external action, but with the exception of our chapter on autocratization in the neighborhood with Professor Luca Tomini. There is no chapter per se on foreign policy making. And the third point is that we couldn't address critical theories or post-structural reuse in the book, but why not having a second volume that might also include these ideas that you mentioned. On your second and third question on the theories, toolkit for analyzing the concept of crisis, a combination of theories, I think is the right way to address crisis. And this is something that we try to emphasize in the introduction, but also in the conclusion especially. Different theories explain different crises or different parts of the same crisis. So it would be, in my view, unfair leaving aside some theories and focusing maybe on three key elements like sovereignty, legitimacy, or politicization. But you're definitely right. I think in order to understand the complexity of crisis, especially this interaction between crisis and the integration process and sociological challenges that you also mentioned, especially politicization needs to be integrated systematically as a variable in integration theories. On Thomas' question, I think Natalie has already responded, and the authors of the chapter, actually, Ramona and Amandine and Natalie, they are here, so I will leave this question to them. So thank you very much for all your comments and questions.
Thank you, Seda and Natalie. Before we go to the second part, Professor Costa wanted to add a question to both of you. So I'll let him just do that, and you can straight ahead start responding.
Yeah, sorry, I was so much concerned about not being too long and eating the time of my dear colleagues that I forgot the question. I will just focus on one. It's a question for Amandine and Ramona. The title of your book is Governance and Politics in the Post-Crises European Union. And when I read the book, I was a bit surprised because we have 4 chapters on the political regime, among which 1 on history and 1 on theory, so 2 on the political regime, 11 on policies, 3 on debates dealing with democracy identity. So why did you focus so much on policies and not on institutions, actors, parties, citizens, public opinion? So I know part of the answer because the 11 policy chapter are in fact dealing very much with dynamics and governance and actors, but still.
Okay, I want to thank you really for your positive feedback. It's very, very encouraging, and also for pointing everything we need to do for the next edition of the textbook. So we have our to-do list. And even without the question, Olivier, I was going to address that point. Part of the explanation, which is no excuse, is that this textbook is also an output of a Horizon 2020 research project called Enlighten that we had at the Institute a few years ago, and which focused on policy issues surrounding the Eurozone crisis. And that's part of the explanation, which also explains what Clément said about the kind of homogeneous perspective. So it's both a problem and an advantage, but we're totally aware of that. So we're planning to have a better balance and have more on the institutional aspects in the next edition. And what is nice, though, is that all the authors from the institutional part of the book in their chapters make a really good job in linking the policy aspects and the institutional dynamics, and that's definitely something that we want to keep doing forward. Now, going to Thomas's comments, what I really take and that from this pandemic and the responses of the EU, and that we would have to integrate also in the future, is obviously this great shift, you know, away from austerity and retrenchment to investment, this increased awareness of the fact that social issues are really key, the shift towards new resources, new instruments. And this is both empirically and theoretically relevant, because it means that theoretically, nothing is locked in. And a lot of analysis in the past decade, focusing on the euro crisis, we're saying, you know, over-constitutionalization of the EU economic policy and so forth and so on. And we see that nothing is locked in from one crisis to the other. Locked in can, to a certain extent, be also unlocked because of politics to a certain extent, or despite perhaps some forms of politics and politicization. So I think all this is extremely interesting and should be integrated certainly in the future. And finally, to Clément, I'm not sure how to address some of the gaps that you've mentioned, very rightly so, without increasing perhaps the unbalance between, you know, political economy geared chapters, and also the difficulty being that we did not ascribe any kind of theoretical perspective to the authors. We did put forward the questions. That was really important for us, that the chapters would ask questions and would deal with questions rather than with just, you know, topics. But you saw things in the textbook that we didn't see ourselves. So I think your comments were very, very nice in that sense. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. I have to say that I've never heard so many positive comments and feedback in an academic panel. So you know what I'm saying. So I will immediately after the panel will share the good news to our contributors, all the very nice words that we heard in this panel. So I will also try to answer very briefly to the four discussants. So first of all, Olivier, I'm happy that you asked this question at the end about the imbalance between policies and institutions. And Amandine is here to say that I keep saying from the very beginning that this part should be improved. We need more on institutions, probably because I'm more interested in that. So point taken, and very, very important one. And I would also want to say that I like your comment about the ever closer union. Point, which is, I would say, our statement on page 1, when we say that we don't take for granted the teleological vision of the integration. And I think we are in this very important moment of the integration process when we should ask ourselves this question, and we say it on page 1, more EU to do what? So I think I really appreciate this comment, and it was our statement, or at least a very important point for us as editors. Thomas Christiansen, also a very interesting question about lessons learned, and Amandine already said a couple of things, but we can give the example of the economic crisis and the European semester, which was one of the core, research part of the research in this enlightened process. And lessons learned is that change is possible and change is incremental. We saw it with the European semester in terms of institutional powers, in terms of governance, but also in terms of ideational change. So this is not in the textbook, but this is what we learned from the crisis: institutional change and both in ideational change, and this move from austerity and structural reforms and conditionality towards more flexibility, and the various very ambitious now decision to have a an important budget to deal with the consequences of the pandemic. All of this discussed by Vivian Schmidt, our co-editor in the new book, which is the analysis of both institutional change and ideational change. But this being said, the process is incomplete, and I will show another book that I really liked, which is that although we see change in institutional terms and ideational terms, there is still needs to democratize the economic structure. So this is another amazing book, How to Democratize Europe in Terms of Economic Government. So change possible, but still incomplete, I would say to your question. And then Clément, yes, Troika is missing in the chapter, but I think this is not an excuse. I think that we were so happy to have our colleagues in international political economy, you know, because this is rare in general. And we were so happy to have Cornel Barn writing about European Central Bank. We were fascinated with this, and yeah, the Troika is not in the book, but as Amandine said, we hope to have a second edition, and in the second edition, Troika will be included, and we probably invite you to help us with this contribution. That would be amazing. And I think, yes, I addressed all the points. So.
Okay, thank you very much, Ramona. What I would like to do, we have about 10 minutes left, and I'll ask other participants if they want to either raise their hands and ask the question themselves or put it on the chat. I have one question that came before the meeting today from Neil Mortimer, PhD researcher at Loughborough University. I believe he is here. So if he wants to ask the question directly, just turn on your camera and microphone. Otherwise, I have your question here, so I will give you a second to decide.
Hi there. I hope you can all see me now. I was just wondering, basically, so I'm working on experimentation in times of crisis and the reactions and the governance procedures that we have in the EU. So quite simply, my question is do you see the role of experimental governance as a solution out of these crises that we have in the EU, and what your thoughts are on experimentalist governance, the theory itself? Thank you very much.
I propose we take another question from Frank Matthijs and then we respond.
Yes, hi everyone. So congrats also from my part to the editors. So I think it becomes very clear that crisis is somewhat omnipresent, not only in the last decade, but I can hardly remember any decade that was somewhat free of crises. But I was wondering what this omnipresence of crisis means for the analytical power of crisis as a concept. So two concrete questions here. So what would be the opposite of crisis in European integration? So would this be sort of a prolonged period of calm, certainty, harmony? And is this even like imaginable in analytical terms? And the second question relates more to the idea of crisis as a process, which seems to be very relevant because it focuses on transformation, adaptation. But I was wondering, is a true crisis not just a transformation of European integration, but simply the failure of integration at all? So a transformation from integration to a completely system. Thank you.
I will take one last question from Lucas Kram, and then we'll see if we have time for more.
Yes, hi everybody. I hope you can see me. Thanks for this fascinating talk, and congratulations to the two books. I would have a small question, because several of you were saying that we have seen a transformation as a kind of answer or response or outcome of the EU's polycrisis. But isn't this necessary to distinguish more properly between different crises that together form the polycrisis? So I would say that the outcome, the particular outcome of the migration crisis, was very different from the outcome of the Eurozone crisis. So overall, there might be something like a transformation, but when it comes to individual crises, there have been sub-outcomes, if you want. And then maybe an add-up on this, what would be empirical manifestations of concrete outcomes? So for example, what makes a transformation against a pure adaptation in terms of change? Thanks a lot.
Thank you all for your questions. I will let you respond in the order that you prefer. Perhaps Ramona?
Yes, maybe. Yes, very briefly, I will try to respond to the question on experimentalist governance. I have to say that I need to read again the book by Isabel and Zeitlin, which was published in 2010, probably Thomas Christiansen or Olivier Costa, you can help me here. I think that what we observed in the context of the Eurozone crisis is not really incompatible with what Isabel and Zeitlin conceptualized 10 years ago as experimentalist governance, in the sense that they were defining this model as a process of setting goals and also learning practices and a lot of deliberation. Well, I think that this is the key word, and this is where we see a lot of connections between the concepts coined by Jonathan Zeitlin and his co-author and what we learn from the crisis, because the key word is now deliberation at different levels. And again, this example of the European semester, I think, illustrates very nicely this process of deliberation at different levels. So that would be my response, and thank you very much for your question.
I can maybe.
Yes, Amandine?
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Amandine.
Oh, sorry.
Okay. Yeah, I was going to say a few words about the last question by Lucas, and actually I don't really have an answer. I think this question of change and how we assess change is one of the trickiest questions of political science, perhaps in general, and certainly in European studies, because what we see, I think, is very clear through the textbook, is always a combination of continuity and change. So in that sense, and it's also an inbuilt definition of what a crisis is. So is transformative, in-depth change a requirement to call an event a crisis? We have often argued in the case of the Eurozone crisis that it had been a crisis which had only reinforced pre-existing trends. So in that sense, it wasn't that transformative in the sense of a radical, paradigm shift. So I don't see any other, solution in terms of research than just trying to set some yardsticks in terms of the institutional mechanisms and in terms of the policy solutions and their underlying ideas to really assess the nature of change, bearing in mind that also change doesn't happen straight away. So change unfolds over time. So whether you're trying to measure change, for instance, induced by the pandemic now, or in 2 years from now, you may formulate a different answer. And that makes our job, I think, very difficult as well, because, we tend to be caught in this accelerated moment where we need to comment. We are asked by journalists, we want to write blog, to comment live on what is going on. And sometimes we say stuff that is completely outdated 6 months afterwards. So I leave you with that. I don't know myself. I don't know how to deal with all this.
Nathalie?
Yeah, I just wanted to come back to Frank's question. I think you're right. There is an omnipresence of crisis. What we have we've been trying to do in the book with Seda is to show that on the one hand, the unfinished nature of the EU makes it prone to crisis. So we are not claiming that it's the first time that the EU has been in crisis. So I don't have a precise answer on your question of what would be the opposition of a crisis. However, we try to specify the criteria that makes the decade of crisis different from previous crises. For instance, that it's on core issues of the European integration, that because it was on core issues, the cost of inaction are very high, and it's less comparable to crises seeking to reform or deepen European integration. It's also a prolonged period of crisis with a high contagion risk. It's multidimensional, and it's the result of both endogenous and exogenous shocks. On the fact whether crisis is a transformation or a failure, well, of course, it depends on your normative and theoretical lens. If you start from the idea that we have a plan towards a more federal union, for instance, of course, you will see a crisis as a failure. But if you start from the assumption that there is no plan for the EU and that it just evolves according to the crisis, you see a transformation and not necessarily a failure.
Thank you very much to all of you. Unless one of the editors would like to add something, we have come to the end. We would like to really give you a warm applause to all of you. Thank you to all of our discussants for their insights and their points for amelioration of these already wonderful books. Thank you all for your questions, contributions, and for being with us on behalf of the Institute and of the CEVIPOL. This has been a great session. I've been really happy to moderate such a wonderful group of people who respect time. You've made my job very easy. And I will give the editors the floor if they want to say thanks and goodbye directly. Otherwise, we will just wrap it up. Are we good? Well, thank you all, and have a nice evening, a nice afternoon, a nice evening, and we'll see you again soon, hopefully.